This recording will conclude Chapter 13. We got through most of conduct in class. We had 2 short topics left, and then we had a short piece on the performance that we need to go through. Just to reorient you, so far in conduct we had talked about not-for-profit hospital systems. Since they don't maximize profit, what is their motivation? And we talked about maximizing quantity and maximizing quality. So we'll review that when we get to the Chapter 13 review. You'll see that again. We talked about the impact of competition on hospital behavior, and we looked at that before and after the prospective payment system went in place, when Medicare started reimbursing on a fixed DRG per admission, and private payers then quickly adopted that method of reimbursement. We looked at the impact of who owns the hospitals. How do hospitals perform differently when or act differently when they're owned by the government, when they're for-profit, or when they're not for-profit. And we looked at the impact of managed care organizations. When managed care moves into a region and they start to negotiate with hospitals and manage the care of the patients, how do we see that affect the conduct of the hospitals? And we have 2 final topics to deal with in conduct. The first of those topics is the impact of price regulations. Price regulations are no longer very common. We did talk about one example in Maryland when we were looking at Chapter 16 and looking at national health reform and some of the state-based initiatives that informed health reform. Prior to the mid-1990s, there actually were several states that were regulating hospital prices. So they effectively said, okay, this is the price for this hospital. In the case of Maryland, they set a single price that's paid for all public and private payers. And early on, when states did this, when the governments regulated prices, it did result in decreased costs. But those savings were not sustained over time, as hospitals brought information to the negotiating table when they were negotiating those regulated prices, and they were able to justify significant price increases, and so those early savings were not sustained. So all states but Maryland have dropped their price regulations, and most of that happened in the mid-1990s, letting market forces and the HMOs and other insurers negotiate with the hospitals for prices. You would think by regulating prices and holding prices down, the hospitals would start to stint on quality in an effort to meet those reduced prices, but actually the evidence of the impact of regulated prices on quality is mixed. There's no clear evidence that regulated prices leads to lower quality. And the last subject under conduct is cost shifting. The cost shifting theory is that hospitals, because they lose revenue from the lower fees paid by Medicare and Medicaid, will artificially inflate the fees that they agreed to be paid in negotiations by private payers. And the empirical evidence on cost shifting actually is mixed. It's been difficult to demonstrate that when Medicare and Medicaid prices drop, that we see a reaction in private payer prices, with those private payer prices going up. Maybe one of the reasons that there isn't clear evidence of cost shifting is that it's not necessarily the first reaction that hospitals might have to react to lower Medicare and Medicaid prices by bumping up private prices. It may be that they're just as likely to generate efficiencies and think about reducing length of stay and other things that will cause their cost structure to decline. And you'll remember that article we read earlier in the semester by Cook and others that talked about re-engineering cardiac ICU in Mayo in response to low Medicare DRGs. And so that's an example of that other type of reaction. Rather than by shifting costs, they looked for efficiencies to be able to work within the lower Medicare reimbursement rates. That finishes up conduct. Now we move to performance, and there are 4 topics in the performance section. Performance, looking at spending on hospitals as a percent of GDP, looking at price inflation over time, looking at whether we're on the flat of the health production curve, and finally, what can we learn from profit margins about how well hospitals are performing? Spending on hospitals as a percent of GDP has grown pretty significantly. You'll see here in these statistics, in 1960, we spent 1.7% of our gross domestic product on hospitals. That was before Medicare and Medicaid were put in place, so many people didn't have access to insurance, and hospital stays were based on charity or people just couldn't afford them. So there was actually quite a bit big reduction in the amount spent on hospitals relative to where we are now. By 1995, we'd seen that big growth in employment-based health insurance. We'd seen the implementation of Medicare and Medicaid, and that was nationwide. So by 1995, we were spending 4.6% of our GDP on hospitals. Of course, between 1960 and 1995, there was also a big jump in technology and the value of hospitalization as well, and which would encourage us to spend more on hospitalization. We actually saw a decline between 95 and 2000. It dropped from 4.6 to 4.2% of GDP. The reason for this is that was kind of the height of the HMO movement. HMOs were negotiating price discounts, and so while we might have seen just as much utilization, just as many hospital admissions, the cost per admission had dropped significantly because the HMOs were negotiating big discounts. But that rebounded between 2000 and 2010 as we moved away from the in-network only HMO type of plan to PPOs and point of service plans where you have in and out of network benefits. When we don't have as strict a steerage of patients into the hospital, when people have a choice of going in or out of network, it's harder to negotiate such a deep discount from that hospital system. So discounts are not quite as deep under a PPO style plan as they are under the HMO plan. It's part of the rebound. Also, growth in technology. In those 10 years, those are 10 very important years in terms of what we could do. And so much more inpatient spending or more complex mix on inpatient spending because of the growth in technology. The next subject in performance is price inflation. So I'm thinking about apples to apples, not an increase in technology, not moving from one type of procedure to a much more complex procedure, but apples to apples, a vaginal delivery to vaginal delivery. How have prices grown? And that when you have that consistent market basket or the consistent types of services and you look at their growth, that's what's going on in the Consumer Price Index. So we're trying to get at just price changes. And over the last couple of decades, the Hospital Consumer Price Index has actually run about 3% higher than our general inflation, our general CPI. That's a huge gap when you think of that accumulated year over year. Some of the reasons for that, or one of the major reasons for that excess price increase is because hospital consolidation has happened and they have much more monopoly power in their negotiations with insurance companies. In 1994 to 1997, that consolidation was really in reaction to the growth of the HMOs. As HMOs were coming in and starting to negotiate fees, small independent hospitals didn't have a lot of power in that negotiation with the HMOs. So there was a lot of consolidation so that they could get a system of hospitals to have a little more balanced negotiating power with the HMOs. From 2004 to 2007, acquisitions were happening in large part because it was a time of really low inflation, really low interest rates. And so it was easy to borrow capital to acquire hospitals because the cost of capital was low. So there were a lot of private buyouts, a lot of movement from not-for-profit to for-profit systems, some mega mergers between large systems, and just a lot of general acquisition of smaller hospitals to build up hospital systems. More recently, since the Affordable Care Act was passed in 2010, some of that consolidation was happening to form large vertically integrated hospital and physician systems to function as ACOs, that is, accountable care organizations, that were large enough to take the risk in shared savings contracting. Next topic is the question of whether we're on the flat of the health production curve. The Dartmouth Atlas suggests that we are, and you remember that concept about being on the flat of the curve. medical care is the input and health is the output, right? So if we use hospital services, we should improve our health. And the question is whether we are at the flat of the curve where more medical input has a very small incremental effect on the amount of improved health. The Dartmouth Atlas suggests that we are on the flat of the health production curve. You remember that's that group of researchers in in Dartmouth that have documented pretty significant regional variations in patterns of care across the country. And so they've documented regional variations in inpatient and specialty care, but there is no accompanying large variation in the outcome or patient satisfaction in the health outcomes or in patient satisfaction for receiving that excess care. So you'd think that if we weren't on the flat of the curve, some areas of the country using more inpatient care should have better outcomes. And if we're not seeing better outcomes in the areas that are using more care, that indicates that we're probably on the flat of the curve. Just want a small caveat on that. Remember, the Dartmouth Atlas is based primarily on Medicare claims only, so we're making judgments based on the elderly population. The more general literature is a little more inconclusive, so we need to be a little cautious when we're making that statement. But certainly the Dartmouth Atlas is giving us some evidence that we may be on the flat of the curve. And the final topic is profit margins. If we see one hospital system that has a higher profit margin than the other hospital system, are they maybe working in a more efficient way? They've pared their costs down so that they can reflect a larger profit. Just want to warn you to be careful about profit margins. Some of the profit margin differences are driven not by efficiencies, but by the varying mix of private, Medicare, and Medicaid patients. You know, Medicare and Medicaid get reimbursed at a lower price, so it would be harder to develop economic profit. The other reason why you need to be really cautious with profit margins is that profit's not a very good measure in healthcare because it's easy to inflate recorded costs. If you make a large investment in a capital investment, like buy an MRI machine, you can choose the period of time over which you amortize that cost, and you can if you spread it over 3 years versus spreading it over 10 years, that really gives you a very different outcome. You can hide economic profit in perks for administrators. You can hide economic profit in what I'll call prestige spending, so expanding technology to improve the prestige of your hospital, whether you need that spending or not. So be careful looking at profit as a measure of efficiency. We really need cost information rather than profit information to judge efficiencies. And that's the end of chapter 13.